if we invited you to ask some science questions, why, that's the first thing that a scientist does.
Ask many questions.
Yeah, and well, what kind of questions? We were up in San Francisco for this, and one question was, how do you use a laser beam to zap a rock and turn it into dust and then analyze what it's made of and figure out what that rock is made of on Mars? And then another question was, is it possible that the streaks across the Valles Marineris on Mars are actually briny water seeping out of the ground?
Or maybe just some sort of dust storm.
Well, yeah. And one of the scientists, all he does is ask questions about dust storms. He has been at it for years, looking at how dust is blown around everywhere on Mars. Now, can you imagine getting that interested in dust storms?
Well, they're a big deal on Mars.
They are.
They helped get one of the rovers out.
Well, but now, that's what those scientists were asking. I wonder what these scientists would ask.
That's a good question, because we have a room full of scientists right here, lots of young scientists. So what are questions that you have? Maybe you heard things in your science class, or you watch science shows or anything like that on TV. And anything you've heard that you've always wondered what it meant?
I can see you have a question right on the tip of your tongue. Go ahead, stick out your tongue. Come on. Okay, so what are you wondering? What have you always wondered? How far is Pluto? Oh, that's one of my favorite topics. You know why it's one of my favorite topics? When I first started working at JPL in 1994, I was able to answer the phone, Pluto Fast Flyby pre-projects. I worked for Pluto. Well, I didn't work for Pluto, the planet, but we worked for the group of scientists.
Pluto the dog?
What was that?
Pluto from Disney?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. Pluto the dog was invented in the same year that Pluto the planet was discovered by Clyde Tombaugh. And, by the way, Clyde Tombaugh at that time was only 24 years old. And he was working at the Lowell Observatory in Arizona. And what he had to do was go up in the cold, in Flagstaff, Arizona, in the winter. It's up high elevation. It gets cold. And so on a cold February night, he was taking a series of photographs through the telescope. And then what he had to do is take these photographs, which were like a big circle of glass. Now this is 1930. We don't use big pieces of glass as photographic plates today.
How many of you remember 1930? I remember 1930. It was a good year.
It was the beginning of the Depression. The discovery of Pluto was the good news that year.
That was a great year. It was great.
So they would put one piece of glass here, one piece of glass here, and of course it would be filled with stars. And then what happens is if you take this section, compare it to this section, most of the stars would be in exactly the same place. But if there was something moving closer, it would look like it's jumping. So you'd open one eye here, then another eye here, and it would it's called a blink parameter.
Are you okay?
Blink comparator.
Blink comparator?
Yeah.
Comparator?
Yeah, it means it compares two things while the light is blinking one on the other. It's sort of like your blinkers on your car. If you were to go out and see if it's working, and you look and say, it's working, it's not, it's working, it's not, it's no. Because
mine just beeps.
Yours just beeps?
Yeah.
Oh.
It's
Well,
not as fancy.
in this case, if you saw a little jump, that would be something there. And that's how he found it. He saw a little jump, and that turned out to be Pluto. Now, you've probably heard that they have changed the status of Pluto.
We don't like to talk about that in astronomy. It's not a fun story.
How many of you have heard about that? Is Pluto a planet or not?
Who's in Pluto's corner? Come on. Pluto, yeah, Pluto a planet. Pluto, 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 Pluto.
Well, it's a funny thing about science terminology. If you were back in, say, Greek times before there were any telescopes at all, and you looked up at the sky, you would have only seen a handful of planets. A planet was anything that was not acting like a star.
Well, how does a star act?
Like this.
Can I get your autograph? Thanks.
Well, stars seem to move across the sky in the same patterns all the time. But a planet sometimes is over here, sometimes it's over here, sometimes it's over there. They tend to be in the same area, and sometimes they seem to move this way and then move that way, and then move this way. And they have strange wandering movements. In fact, planet means wanderer.
That's right.
Yeah. Isn't that wild? That the word, so anything that's wandering about is a planet. Hey, you over there, quit wandering about, you planet. So, oh, what have you been doing all day? Oh, I've just been a planet all day long. Wandering in the backyard. Yeah, okay, so Pluto was given the status of a planet. And it was the first time that someone from this side of the Atlantic Ocean had officially been given the credit for finding a planet. Now, the funny thing about that, because I'm sure people who lived here on this side of the ocean centuries ago also saw planets. But it was all these European astronomers that could see things through telescopes. And so there was an excitement in 1930 that it was an American astronomer and a young astronomer who found it. And so it was celebrated. And in fact, by the way, Clyde Tombaugh lived well into his 90s. He was still alive when we were starting the mission to send a spacecraft to Pluto. Now, what happened? We got to see that there were more objects way out there than just Pluto. It turned out to be, it was Pluto plus maybe about 30,000 neighbors distributed in this big band at that distance. Now, your question was how far is Pluto out there? Well, when you form a solar system, it's like an explosion of energy that took all the material and it started spinning around. And some of the debris from on the outer edges were made of rock and ice, and Pluto was one of those chunks. But all those other 30,000 things were also floating out there. We couldn't see all those back in 1930.
Telescopes just weren't strong enough.
That's right. And it wasn't until 1970 that we even knew that Pluto had a little moon. It looked like it was just kind of ill-shapen, but it turned out to have a whole moon around it. Now we found 3 other moons. But, so they had to think, so do we now have a solar system with 9 planets and 30,000 little neighbor planets? Or do we now have to have 30,000 planets? And it's hard enough to remember the names of 9 planets. Can you imagine having to remember 30,000 planets? So, so the scientists, well, they kind of argued about this. You know what? I think that we should change the status of Pluto to be more representative of what all those objects out in that region are. What do you think?
Then I think that Pluto is a planet, and so Pluto should stay.
But if the information we have now is different than it was when we started and we learned something new, you know, like there are all these icy dwarf planets. Maybe that's what we should call them. That sounds awful, doesn't it?
Yes, what are you saying? He's one of these dwarfs, you know, the 7 dwarfs, hi-ho, hi-ho.
It's
or
off to Pluto we go. Oh.
I don't know, that sounds too silly for science.
Yeah. Wait a minute, it wasn't too silly for Disney.
Well, you know, Disney makes money, scientists, we...
Okay, so now here's what they decided. Actually, I kind of like this, what they finally decided. You know, there's an asteroid belt. Yeah. Are you wearing an asteroid belt?
I left mine at home. I'm a little embarrassed.
The asteroids are a belt of planets that didn't quite become a planet. It's debris between Mars and Jupiter.
It's kind of what was left over from the beginnings of the solar system.
Right. Yeah. And out by where Pluto is, it's the same thing, except that it's a ring farther out. And in that ring now we call, actually, I like this, they call them Plutoids.
Plutoids.
Would you like a Plutoid?
Oh yes, I've got really bad breath.
There you go. No.
It tastes like Pluto.
Yeah, it does.
It's kind of spicy.
And so the idea now is that we're honoring Pluto by calling all of these objects Plutoids. Now, I kind of like that.
It's got a ring to it. I guess I could live with it.
Yeah. So we've got, of course, that means we have, well, there's a couple of other things in the solar system that are bigger than Pluto. There's a couple of things that are kind of wandering out there all by themselves, like Ceres.
Yeah.
But anyway, so how far is Pluto out there? Now remember, you could actually calculate this from information I've already said. I said that at 85,000 miles per hour, it took 9 years to get there. So how many hours are there in 9 years? Huh.
Well, quite a
You
big
can answer that
number.
question and then multiply those two numbers together.
Well, I think there's 24 hours in a day.
Well, there might, yeah.
But miles and I left my calculator at home.
Well, but you are on the right track. You'd have to get 24 hours a day times 365 days per year times 9 years. So you could probably get there. Another way we could do it is instead of using miles, we could use astronomical units.
AU.
AU.
AU. Hey, you mean how far are you from the sun?
Okay, so the distance, wait a minute, I need some volunteers. I need somebody to be a son and somebody to be a daughter. I mean a son